The biting winter wind gnawed at my skin as I hurried down the narrow steps of our cramped apartment, gripping a hastily packed duffel bag in one hand and holding tightly to the small trembling fingers of my 6-year-old son, Ethan. His thin arms clung to my leg, his shivers betraying both the cold and the lingering fear that hung over us like a storm cloud. The echo of my husband Mark's furious voice still rang in my ears. His final words seared into my mind. "Don't come back." The sting of his slap was fresh, a burning reminder of how quickly everything had spiraled. I stood frozen at the edge of the sidewalk, the weight of the last few minutes crashing down on me. Mark had shouted before. He had lashed out in anger. But this time, it was different. This time something inside me broke. I had crossed a line he couldn't forgive, but it was one I was willing to cross 1,000 times over if it meant saving my son's life. Ethan had been sick for days. What I first brushed off as a common cold had worsened, his chest rattling with every breath, his cheeks flushed with fever. I could see the fear in his eyes as he coughed into his small hands. My heart shattered a little more each time. Mark's paycheck from the steel plant barely stretched enough to cover food and rent. There was never extra, no room for emergencies. But this wasn't something I could ignore. I had to do something. So I took the last few bills from the jar in the kitchen, the small stash I'd been hiding for weeks, and brought Ethan to Dr. Grady, the gentle physician at the community health center. Dr. Grady's brows knitted as he listened to Ethan's breathing, his hand resting on his stethoscope a little too long. "Pneumonia," he said with a quiet sigh. "We need to start him on antibiotics immediately. Any delay could be dangerous." I nodded, fighting back tears as Ethan leaned against me, his warm body pressing into mine. "I'll make sure he takes every dose," I promised, clutching the prescription slip as if it held our last hope. The medicine wasn't cheap. I knew Mark would be furious when he found out I'd spent the savings. But as I looked down at Ethan, his breathing shallow and uneven, I knew there was no decision to make. For 3 days I gave Ethan his medicine in secret, measuring out the sticky pink liquid while Mark was at work or asleep. I thought I could keep it hidden, but Mark came home early that night. His eyes narrowed as he caught me with the small plastic spoon in hand. "What's that?" he asked, his voice sharp and low. I swallowed hard, but there was no point lying. "Ethan's sick," I said quickly. "Dr. Grady prescribed antibiotics. Mark's face darkened as he stepped closer, his words cutting through my explanation like a blade. "You spent our money on that, without telling me?" His fists clenched at his sides. "Please, Mark," I whispered, stepping back as Ethan watched from the couch, wide-eyed and scared. "I had to. Ethan needs it." The slap came faster than I expected, knocking the bottle from my hand. It shattered on the tile floor, the pink liquid pooling beneath my feet. Mark's voice was cold and unforgiving. "Clean it up. When you're done, get out. I won't have a wife who goes behind my back." Now here I was, standing on the frozen sidewalk, Ethan shivering beside me, my entire life stuffed into a single bag slung over my shoulder. I didn't know where we would go. I had no plan. But I knew one thing. I couldn't let Ethan see me crumble. "Mommy?" Ethan's small voice broke the silence. "Where are we going?" I knelt in front of him, brushing a curl of his hair away from his damp forehead. His fevered eyes searched mine, and I forced a smile. "We're going on an adventure, sweetheart. But first, we need to find somewhere warm." I took his hand and started walking, one step at a time. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of a passing car and the faint melody of music drifting from a second-story window. On any other night, the city felt familiar. Tonight, it felt cold and indifferent. I thought about my parents, but they lived too far out of town. I didn't have the bus fare, and even if I did, showing up at their doorstep meant explaining too much. I thought about friends, but most of them were Mark's friends now. I couldn't trust anyone not to tell him where I was. As we rounded a corner, a small sign flickered beneath the glow of a street lamp. Rosehaven Shelter for Women. I'd passed it dozens of times on my way to the market, but I never imagined I would need to step through its doors. I hesitated at the entrance, my hand resting on the worn brass handle. Was this really happening? Was I truly at the point where I had to admit defeat? Ethan coughed, his small body racked by the effort, and I knew the answer. This wasn't about pride or failure. It was about keeping him safe. I pushed open the door, the warmth inside hitting me like a wave. A woman at the front desk looked up, her eyes softening as she took in our disheveled appearance. "Good evening," she said, rising to her feet. "How can I help you?" The kindness in her voice was enough to break me. The tears I'd been holding back for weeks spilled over as I clutched Ethan closer. "Please," I managed to choke out. "We need help." The warmth hit me like a wave as I stepped inside, carrying Ethan in my arms. The chill of the night still clung to us, but the small lobby of the shelter offered a comfort I hadn't felt in years. A woman at the front desk looked up, her eyes widening slightly as she took in our appearance, my swollen face and Ethan's pale, fevered skin. "Boa noite," she said softly, rising from her chair. "Can I help you?" Her kindness was my undoing. Tears I'd held back for hours, maybe longer, slipped down my cheeks. "Please," I choked out. "We need help." The next few hours passed in a blur. The woman introduced herself as Angela and guided us to a small room with 2 narrow beds. Ethan's eyes barely stayed open as Angela tucked a thick blanket around him, her gentle hands moving with practiced care. She left briefly and returned with a steaming bowl of chicken soup. The smell filled the room, pulling at memories I hadn't visited in so long, of warm kitchens and safer times. Ethan ate slowly, exhaustion tugging at his small frame. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching him, my heart still hammering from the night's events. Angela sat across from me, her gaze patient but curious. "Can you tell me what happened?" she asked quietly, not pressing but leaving the door open. And so I told her. I told her everything. Not just about tonight, but the last 2 years. How Mark's temper had grown like a slow-moving storm, building until it felt impossible to escape. I recounted the slammed doors, the cutting words, the nights I spent wondering if I had somehow caused it all. I explained how I thought if I just loved him more, tried harder, things would get better. Angela listened without interruption, her hand gently resting on mine when I finally fell silent. "Maya," she said, her voice steady but soft, "what you've been through isn't your fault, and you did the right thing by coming here." Her words cracked something open inside me. The weight I'd been carrying for so long, the blame, the shame, began to slip from my shoulders. I buried my face in my hands and wept, letting years of silent suffering finally find a voice. Angela stayed with me, her arm light around my shoulders, grounding me in the quiet comfort of her presence. When the tears dried, she helped settle Ethan into bed, his labored breathing soft but steady. I lay beside him on the narrow mattress, holding his small hand in mine. I listened to the unfamiliar creaks of the shelter, to the hum of distant voices down the hall, and to the soft rattle of Ethan's breath. Questions swirled in my mind. Where would we go from here? How would I protect him? Would Mark try to find us? But for the first time, hope flickered beneath the fear. I had taken the first step. Whatever came next, I would face it. As the night crept on, I drifted into a fitful sleep, Ethan's small hand still wrapped in mine. The gray morning light crept in through the thin curtains when I woke. For a moment I forgot where I was, disoriented by the plain room and unfamiliar bed. Then the memories of the night before came flooding back. Ethan lay beside me, his cheeks flushed but peaceful. I pressed the back of my hand to his forehead, still warm, but not as burning as before. A soft knock at the door startled me. Angela stepped in quietly, a gentle smile on her face. "Good morning, Maya," she said, lowering her voice as her eyes flickered to Ethan. "How are you two doing?" I sat up, rubbing my eyes. "We're okay," I answered hesitantly. "Ethan's still sick though, his cough worries me." Angela nodded with understanding. "A nurse comes in every morning to check on the residents. I'll make sure Ethan's seen first." Almost on cue, Ethan stirred, his small body shaking with another fit of coughing. I helped him sit up, rubbing his back until it passed. Angela left briefly and returned with a glass of water and tissues. Moments later, an older woman entered, her presence brisk but kind. "I'm Nora," she said, kneeling beside the bed to examine Ethan. Her hands were warm and her eyes sharp, flicking over him with practiced care. After a few minutes, she straightened. "The antibiotics are helping, but he's not out of the woods yet. We need to continue his treatment." I hesitated, the lump forming in my throat again. I don't have any money." Nora patted my hand gently. "Don't worry about that. We have a fund for emergencies like this." Ethan's health comes first. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I nearly sobbed. As Nora left to arrange the prescription, Angela turned back to me. Why don't you grab some breakfast while Ethan rests? Afterward, I'd like you to meet Claire, our social worker. She'll walk you through the next steps and help you figure out what to do from here. I nodded, grateful but nervous. The common area of the shelter bustled with quiet activity, women and children moving through their routines. Some sat at tables eating breakfast, while others talked softly in corners. I made my way to the small kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee. The warmth seeped into my fingers, steadying my nerves. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to safe. The kitchen buzzed quietly with the soft murmur of conversations and the clinking of dishes as I poured myself a cup of coffee. Women moved about, some with distant eyes like mine, while others carried themselves with calm familiarity, as if this place had become a second home. A young woman with dark curls balanced a baby on her hip as she smiled at me. "You're new here, aren't you?" she asked, her voice warm and light. I nodded. "Yeah, I'm Maya," I replied softly, managing a small, tired smile. "This is Ethan. He's upstairs resting. He's been sick." The woman's expression softened as she bounced the baby gently. "I'm Lila, and this little one is Ava," the baby cooed, gnawing on her fingers. "The first few days can feel overwhelming, but don't worry, we all look out for each other here." Her kindness felt like a lifeline I hadn't realized I needed. As we sipped strong coffee and nibbled on bread and cheese, I felt the tightness in my chest begin to ease, if only a little. Lila shared her story, telling me how she had left her boyfriend after learning she was pregnant. His anger had started small, but grew in dangerous bursts. When Ava was born, Lila knew she couldn't let her daughter grow up in that environment. The shelter had taken them in, helping her find work and eventually an apartment. "It's not easy," she admitted, gently stroking Ava's soft hair. "But it's better than living in fear. Ava deserves peace, and so does Ethan." Her words struck something deep within me. Wasn't that exactly why I had left? I wanted Ethan to have a life where he didn't have to flinch at raised voices, where he could play and grow without fear. After breakfast, Angela found me by the window. "Maya, would you mind coming to meet Claire? She's our social worker. She can help you with next steps." I nodded, following Angela through the winding hallway until we reached a small office. Colorful posters lined the walls, messages about empowerment and resources for women starting over. Claire, a middle-aged woman with soft gray hair and warm brown eyes, greeted me with a gentle smile. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please sit down. Can I get you some tea?" I shook my head, folding my hands tightly in my lap. "Angela told me a little, but I'd like to hear from you," Claire said, her voice calm and soothing. "What brought you here, Maya?" And for the second time in 24 hours, I found myself telling the story. This time, though, it felt different. Claire's questions made me look at things I hadn't before. Patterns I had ignored or justified. "When did Mark's behavior start to change?" she asked softly, pen poised above her notebook. I thought carefully, tracing the memory back. "Maybe 2 years ago," I admitted. "He lost his job at the plant. He started drinking more, staying out late. When he was home, he was different, angry. Nothing I did was good enough." Claire nodded, scribbling notes. "And when did it turn physical?" I flinched at the word, as if saying it aloud made it more real. "A year ago. I burned dinner one night, and he slapped me." I swallowed hard. He apologized right away, said it wouldn't happen again. But it did. As I spoke, Claire helped me see the control Mark had slowly taken. How he isolated me from friends, how he monitored our money, how I'd begun doubting myself at every turn, believing maybe I was the problem. "Maya," Claire said gently, leaning forward, "what Mark did to you and Ethan, it's not just wrong, it's illegal. You have the right to press charges and seek a restraining order. We can help with that if you want to move forward." The thought terrified me. What if Mark became angrier? What if he tried to take Ethan away from me? But then I thought about Ethan, the fear in his eyes when Mark yelled, the way he hid behind me when doors slammed. I think I want to file a report," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "Not just for me, for Ethan. He deserves better." Claire's eyes shone with something like pride. "That's a brave decision, Maya. We'll support you every step of the way." The following days blurred into a whirlwind of activity. Ethan's health slowly improved as he finished his antibiotics, and I began to see the color return to his cheeks. With Claire's help, I filed a police report. My hands trembled as I recounted the events to the officer, who listened with quiet professionalism. Afterward, Claire guided me through the paperwork for emergency custody and a temporary restraining order. The legal language felt like a maze, but Claire explained every step patiently. Through it all, the women at the shelter became a source of strength. Lila, especially, became a close friend. Her resilience inspired me when I felt overwhelmed. About a week after we arrived, I returned from meeting with a pro bono lawyer Claire had connected me with. As I turned the corner toward the shelter, my breath caught in my throat. Leaning casually against a lamppost across the street was Mark. My heart pounded, and I ducked behind the corner, pressing against the cold brick wall. What was he doing here? How had he found us? I dared to peek around the corner. He hadn't seen me yet, but I could hear his voice, low and threatening, as he spoke to a passerby. Have you seen a woman with a little boy, dark hair, about this tall? He gestured with his hand. They're my family. I'm just trying to make sure they're safe. The stranger shook his head and continued walking, and Mark's footsteps faded as he moved down the street. I exhaled shakily, waiting several minutes before cautiously making my way back to the shelter, glancing over my shoulder with every step. When I pushed open the front door, Angela was at the desk. One look at my face and her expression hardened. What happened, Maya? Mark, I whispered. He was outside. I waited for what felt like hours, though it had likely only been minutes, before I dared to peer around the corner. The street was empty, but my hands still trembled as I forced my legs to move. I hurried back to the shelter, glancing over my shoulder at every sound. When I finally pushed through the front door, Angela looked up from the desk. Her eyes narrowed the moment she saw my face. Maya, what happened? She asked, rising quickly from her chair. I struggled to find my breath. Mark, I gasped. He was outside. He's looking for us. Angela's warm expression hardened instantly. She picked up the phone without hesitation, calling the police while waving over 2 other staff members. Within moments, the shelter's quiet hum shifted into something more urgent. Doors were locked, curtains drawn, and Angela walked the hallways, counting heads and making sure every woman and child was accounted for. I sat in the common room. Ethan curled up next to me, his small hand gripping mine like a lifeline. As I held him close, the weight of our reality sank in deeper than ever. This wasn't just about fleeing a bad night or even 2 years of abuse. This was about rebuilding everything. A life where Ethan could grow up free from the shadow of Mark's anger. Claire appeared in the doorway, her expression calm but serious as she sat beside me. I know this is frightening, Maya, she said gently. But you're not alone. We'll protect you and Ethan. You're safe here. I nodded, though the fear still knotted in my stomach. Ethan looked up at me, his wide brown eyes searching my face for reassurance. I squeezed his hand and smiled as best I could. We'll be okay, Ethan. We're together, and that's all that matters. He leaned into me, resting his head against my arm. In that moment, I knew, no matter how hard things got, we would face whatever came next together. The days that followed Mark's appearance outside the shelter were a blur of emotions and exhausting legal steps. The shelter became more than a temporary refuge. It became a place where I could breathe, even as we prepared for the battle ahead. Claire helped connect me with a pro bono lawyer named Rachel, a sharp and determined woman who specialized in domestic violence cases. From the moment I met her, I felt a renewed sense of strength. What happened to you and Ethan wasn't your fault, Rachel told me during our first meeting, her eyes fierce. You deserve protection, and we're going to fight for it. Rachel outlined our plan: full custody of Ethan, a permanent restraining order, and financial support. It sounded straightforward when she said it, but I knew the road ahead would be anything but simple. Between meetings, paperwork, and counseling sessions, my world felt like it revolved around legal documents. I learned words like affidavit and deposition, terms that once felt distant but now carried the weight of our future. Ethan, my quiet and resilient boy, rarely complained. Even when we had to move to a different room for extra security, he simply adapted, holding my hand and trusting that I was keeping him safe. His strength gave me the resolve I needed. One evening, as I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me with those solemn, knowing eyes. "Mommy," he whispered, "are we ever going back home?" My chest tightened at his question. How could I explain to a 6-year-old that the place he once called home was no longer safe? I brushed his hair from his forehead, choosing my words carefully. "Ethan, home isn't a building. It's wherever we feel safe and happy. Right now, this is our home, and someday we'll have a new home just for you and me." He seemed to think about this for a moment before nodding. "As long as we're together, right?" Tears burned behind my eyes as I hugged him close. "That's right, as long as we're together." As our court date loomed closer, the tension thickened. Rachel and I worked tirelessly to gather evidence: medical records from Dr. Grady, statements from neighbors who had overheard Mark shouting, and letters from a few brave friends willing to speak about what they had witnessed. But for every step forward, Mark seemed determined to push back. He contested everything, painting me as unstable and exaggerating minor incidents. His lawyer, a polished man in expensive suits, twisted every piece of evidence into something else. The worst came on a quiet afternoon as I left the courthouse after filing additional paperwork. I heard his voice before I saw him, smooth, calm, and chillingly familiar. "Maya." I froze mid-step, my heart leaping to my throat. Slowly, I turned to see him leaning against a car parked nearby. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes held that familiar hard edge. "Don't you think this has gone on long enough?" Mark said, his voice deceptively soft. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You shouldn't be here. There's a restraining order." He waved dismissively, taking a step closer. "A piece of paper won't keep me from seeing my son. You can't do this alone, Maya. You need me. Ethan needs me." His words felt like cold steel, but I stood my ground. "Ethan and I are not coming back, Mark. Just leave us alone." I turned to walk away, my heart pounding, but his next words stopped me cold. "You think you can win this? You're nothing without me, Maya. No judge will side with a woman who can't even keep a roof over her kid's head." Tears stung my eyes, but I kept moving, refusing to let him see the fear he still managed to stir in me. Back at the shelter, I told Rachel everything. She was quiet as she took notes, her expression unreadable until she finally looked up at me. "This is good," she said firmly. "Good?" I asked, confused. "He violated the restraining order. We can use this." Rachel explained. "Stay strong, Maya. You're closer to getting Ethan and yourself the safety you deserve." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Mark's words had shaken me, but Rachel's reassurances helped steady my heart. I wasn't doing this alone anymore, and no matter how hard Mark pushed, I would push harder. I straightened my back, lifting my chin to meet Mark's gaze. "There's nothing to work out," I said, my voice firmer than I thought possible. "Ethan and I aren't coming back. Please, just leave us alone." I turned to walk away, Ethan's name still echoing in my mind. But his next word stopped me cold. "You really think you can do this by yourself?" Mark sneered, his voice low and cutting. "You're nothing without me, Maya. No judge is going to side with a woman who had to run to a shelter." I didn't look back. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I kept walking, each step faster than the last, until I was nearly running. Only when I was inside the shelter, the door locked behind me, did the sobs escape. Lila found me in the hallway, and without a word, she wrapped her arm around me and led me to the common room. I sank into the worn couch as she held me, letting me cry until I had nothing left. That night, after Ethan had drifted to sleep, I sat with Claire and Rachel in the shelter's office, recounting the encounter. Rachel's eyes narrowed as she took notes, her pen pressing hard into the paper. "This is good," she said, glancing up at my confused expression. "Good?" I repeated, incredulous. Rachel nodded. "It might not feel like it, but Mark just violated the restraining order. That will help us in court." Claire placed a hand over mine. "You're stronger than he thinks, Maya. Stronger than you realize. You've come this far." Their words steadied me, but doubt still lingered beneath the surface. Could I really win this? Could I rebuild a life for Ethan and me on my own? As the trial drew closer, Rachel and I spent hours preparing. We rehearsed my testimony, going over every painful detail until I could say it without my voice shaking. She grilled me with potential questions Mark's lawyer might ask, each one designed to twist the truth or make me doubt myself. At night, I lay awake, the weight of the coming battle pressing down on me. The night before the trial, sleep felt impossible. I paced the small room Ethan and I shared, my heart racing with thoughts of what could go wrong. What if the judge didn't believe me? What if Mark convinced them I was unstable, an unfit mother? The fear of losing Ethan overwhelmed everything else. In the early hours of the morning, I found myself in the shelter's small chapel. I wasn't religious, but the quiet, sacred space offered a strange sense of comfort. I sat on one of the wooden pews, staring at the flickering candlelight. "Please," I whispered to the stillness around me. "Give me strength, for Ethan, and for myself." As the first light of dawn crept through the stained glass windows, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't a sudden surge of confidence, but a quiet, steady resolve. We had come too far to stop now. I thought of Ethan, his unwavering trust in me, his small hand gripping mine each night as he drifted to sleep. He needed me to be strong. When I returned to our room, Ethan was just waking up. He rubbed his eyes and smiled sleepily. "Is today the day, Mommy?" he asked, his voice soft but eager. I sat on the edge of his bed, pulling him into a hug. "Yes, sweetheart, today's the day we tell our story." I dressed in the nicest outfit I had managed to bring with me, simple but clean. Ethan wore his best shirt, his small hand firmly holding mine as we prepared to leave. Lila appeared at our door, Ava perched on her hip. "We'll be thinking of you," she said, pulling me into a hug. "You've got this, Maya." In the common room, the other women gathered, offering quiet words of encouragement. A squeeze of the hand, a reassuring smile. Their belief in me bolstered my own. Claire drove us to the courthouse, the city slowly waking around us. I held Ethan's hand tightly as we neared the towering stone building. This was it. The courthouse loomed, grand and imposing in the morning light. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. This wasn't just a trial. This was our chance to reclaim our lives. "You ready?" Claire asked, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. I glanced down at Ethan, his eyes wide but calm. Then I looked up at the courthouse. "Yes," I said firmly, "we're ready." As we climbed the stone steps, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: strength. We were no longer just survivors, we were fighters, ready to face whatever lay ahead. I could feel the sweat gathering at my brow despite the cool morning air. Claire and Rachel walked closely beside me, their calm presence anchoring me against the rush of noise and movement in the courthouse. The crowd felt suffocating, and even the soft beep of the metal detector made me flinch. The security guard gave a reassuring smile as he waved us through, but it barely eased the storm inside me. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Rachel gently tugged my arm, pulling me aside. Her voice was quiet but steady, a stark contrast to the swirling thoughts in my head. "Maya," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Just tell the truth. Your story is powerful, let it speak for itself." I nodded, swallowing hard, as I tried to absorb her confidence. Beside me, Ethan tugged lightly on my hand, his eyes wide as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Mommy?" he whispered, "is Papa going to be here?" His innocent question pierced through me. How could I explain the complexity of what was happening to a 6-year-old? I knelt in front of him, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Yes, sweetheart," I answered softly. "Your father will be here. But remember, no matter what happens, you and I are a team, okay?" Ethan nodded solemnly, his small hand squeezing mine. His quiet trust both strengthened me and left me terrified. I couldn't let him down. As we waited outside the courtroom, I saw Mark arrive with his lawyer. Mark was dressed sharply, his dark suit and calm demeanor polished to perfection. His hair was neatly combed, and to anyone else, he looked like a responsible father. But I knew better. Beneath the smooth exterior, I could see the flicker of anger, like smoldering embers waiting for the right moment to ignite. Our eyes met, and a cold chill ran down my spine. Before I could process the feeling, the courtroom doors opened. "It's time," Rachel murmured, guiding me forward. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, but felt no less intimidating. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and the judge's bench loomed high above us. The weight of every gaze, court officials, strangers, and most of all, Mark, pressed down on me as I took my seat beside Rachel. Judge Eleanor Davis entered, her black robes trailing behind her as she approached the bench. Her expression was stern but not unkind, and when she surveyed the room, I saw the sharpness in her eyes. Court is now in session, Judge Davis announced, her voice firm. The legal procedures blurred together, the opening statements, evidence submissions, witness testimonies. I listened as neighbors spoke about the shouting they overheard from our apartment. Dr. Grady explained Ethan's illness and how I had come to him despite Mark's objections. With each testimony, I felt a strange mix of relief and shame. It was validating to hear the truth laid out so clearly, but it was also painful. How had I let it go on for so long? When Rachel gave my hand a reassuring squeeze, I realized it was my turn. I stood, legs trembling, and walked toward the witness stand. I swore to tell the truth and sat down, gripping the edge of the wooden stand to keep my hands from shaking. I recounted everything, the slow unraveling of Mark's temper, the growing fear that crept into our lives, and the night he threw us out. As I spoke, I felt the strength in my voice grow. This was my moment to be heard. Not just for me, but for Ethan. When I finished, Mark's lawyer stood. He was tall and smooth-talking, his tone laced with artificial sympathy. "Mrs. Sullivan," he began, "is it true you spent money on medical treatment for your son without your husband's consent?" "Yes," I replied, keeping my head high, "because my son's health was at risk." The lawyer paced slowly. "And you don't believe a father has the right to be involved in decisions about his child's medical care?" I took a deep breath, recalling Rachel's advice. "A father absolutely has that right," I said carefully, "but not the right to deny urgent care when a doctor says it's critical." The questions kept coming, each one carefully designed to make me look reckless or unstable. But with each answer, I felt my resolve strengthen. These were my truths. No amount of twisted words could change them. When I returned to my seat, my legs were shaky, but my heart felt steady. Ethan smiled up at me from the bench, giving me a small thumbs up. In that moment, I knew, regardless of the trial's outcome, we had already won something far greater. Freedom. Then it was Mark's turn to testify. I watched as he strode to the stand, his face set in a mask of regret. I knew that look too well, the practiced expression he used when he wanted sympathy. His lawyer led him gently through a crafted story, how he was a hard-working father who had made mistakes but loved his family deeply. "Mr. Sullivan," his lawyer asked, "can you tell us about the night your wife left with your son?" Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping just enough to seem burdened. "It was a misunderstanding," he said softly. "Yes, we argued, but I never meant for them to leave. I was worried sick when I realized they were gone." I gripped the seat beneath me, every part of me screaming to stand up and shout the truth. Rachel's hand on my arm grounded me. Let the process play out. When Rachel stood to cross-examine Mark, her calm demeanor sharpened like a blade. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, "can you explain why you were seen outside the women's shelter last week, despite the restraining order?" Mark's polished exterior cracked, his eyes darkened as his grip on the stand tightened. "I have a right to see my son," he snapped. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Judge Davis's gavel struck hard. "Mr. Sullivan," she warned, "control yourself." I could see it now, the cracks widening beneath the surface of his calm facade. For the first time, I believed that the truth could win. Rachel's eyes narrowed as she faced Mark from across the courtroom. Her voice was calm but unrelenting. "Mr. Sullivan, can you explain why you were seen near the women's shelter where your wife and son were staying, directly violating the temporary restraining order?" For a moment, Mark's carefully composed exterior cracked. His hand gripped the witness stand tighter, and I saw his jaw clench. "I have every right to see my son," he snapped, his voice rising. "She can't keep him from me." A low murmur spread through the courtroom at his outburst. Judge Davis's gavel came down hard, echoing through the room. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "control yourself or you will be held in contempt." Mark inhaled sharply, forcing his shoulders to relax, but the anger simmered beneath the surface. As he worked to regain his composure, I caught a flicker of something in Judge Davis's eyes, recognition. She saw through him, through the mask he had worn for so long. The rest of the trial blurred, a series of legal arguments and closing statements. I sat stiffly, my heart thudding in my chest as Ethan leaned against me, tired from the long day. I stroked his hair, whispering reassurances I wasn't sure I believed. When Judge Davis re-entered the courtroom, the air grew heavy with anticipation. My heart pounded so loudly that I was sure everyone could hear it. This was the moment that would shape our future. In the matter of Sullivan versus Sullivan, Judge Davis began, her voice steady and measured, I have carefully reviewed the evidence presented. This court holds the safety and well-being of children in the highest regard, as well as the right of individuals to live free from fear and harm. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom before resting on me. Mrs. Sullivan, the court finds your testimony credible, and your actions in protecting your son commendable. I held my breath, barely daring to hope. Mr. Sullivan, she continued, her voice firm, your behavior, both inside and outside this courtroom, has demonstrated a troubling pattern of control, intimidation, and disregard for your family's well-being. I squeezed Ethan's hand, my pulse racing. Therefore, Judge Davis said, it is the decision of this court to grant full custody of Ethan Sullivan to his mother, Maya Sullivan. Furthermore, the temporary restraining order is hereby made permanent. The judge's words washed over me like a wave of relief. Tears blurred my vision as I clutched Ethan to my chest. It was over. Rachel's hand rested gently on my shoulder as Claire smiled beside me, pride lighting her face. We did it, I whispered into Ethan's hair, tears streaming down my cheeks. We're going to be okay, sweetheart. Ethan wrapped his arms around my neck, holding me tightly. As we gathered our things to leave, I heard Mark's voice, low and cold. This isn't over, Maya, he hissed from across the courtroom. You can't keep my son from me forever. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the old fear tried to creep back in. My hand instinctively tightened around Ethan's. But before I could respond, Judge Davis's voice rang out, clear and authoritative. Mr. Sullivan, she said sharply, I advise you to think very carefully about your next actions. I turned to see her still seated at the bench, her eyes locked onto Mark with unflinching resolve. These rulings are not suggestions, Judge Davis continued, each word deliberate and heavy. They are legally binding, and I will not hesitate to enforce them to the fullest extent of the law. Is that understood? The room fell silent. Mark's face twisted with barely concealed rage, but under the judge's unwavering gaze, his shoulders sagged slightly. For the first time he looked deflated. I had never seen him back down like that before. Judge Davis wasn't done. Furthermore, she said, her tone softening but remaining firm, let me be clear. What I've seen here today goes beyond a simple dispute between spouses. Your actions reflect a concerning disregard for the safety of your child and his mother. Mr. Sullivan, being a father is not simply a matter of biology. It requires care, respect, and an environment where a child feels secure and loved. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. If you wish to be part of Ethan's life, I strongly suggest you reflect on your behavior and seek the help necessary to demonstrate that you can be the father he deserves. Mark said nothing. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he barely reacted. Court is adjourned, Judge Davis declared, bringing her gavel down with finality. As we stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse, I felt the weight I had carried for so long begin to lift. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time it felt possible, bright, even. Ethan looked up at me, his eyes hopeful. Mommy, are we going home now? I smiled, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Yes, sweetheart, we're going home, to our new beginning of something new. Rachel and Claire walked beside me as we stepped into the sunlight, the courthouse behind us. I held Ethan's hand tightly, feeling the warm weight of his small palm grounding me to this moment. A moment I never thought I'd reach. Judge Davis's words echoed in my head, each one a lifeline pulling me out of the shadows I had lived in for so long. You've done the right thing. For years, I questioned every step, wondering if I was overreacting, if I was somehow to blame for Mark's anger. But today, those doubts felt smaller, quieter. Ethan, I said, looking down at him, we did it. We're free. He gave me a small nod, as if he understood the significance, even if the weight of the moment hadn't fully settled on him. Claire's voice broke through my thoughts. Maya, I know this has been overwhelming, but I hope you realize how strong you've been. Standing up to Mark, doing this for Ethan, it takes courage. You've taken the hardest step. Rachel nodded in agreement. Judge Davis was right. The road ahead may not be simple, but you've already come so far. And you're not alone. Their words washed over me like a salve to the wounds I hadn't realized were still healing. I glanced at Ethan, his trusting eyes watching me closely. "What do you think, sweetheart? Ready for our next adventure?" He nodded solemnly. "Together, right?" "Always together," I whispered, pulling him into a hug. As we walked down the steps, I spotted Lila standing near the plaza with Ava perched on her hip. She rushed toward me the moment our eyes met, wrapping me in a tight, one-armed hug. "I couldn't stay away," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I had to know how it went." Briefly, I recounted the judge's decision, Mark's outburst, and the restraining order being made permanent. Lila's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You did it, Maya," she said, gripping my arm. "You really did it." I shook my head, my heart swelling with gratitude. "We did it," I corrected softly, glancing around at Claire, Rachel, and the other women from the shelter who had been my support when I had none. "I couldn't have done this without all of you." Lila's smile widened. "That's what we do, right? We hold each other up until we can stand on our own." As we stood there, this strange little family formed from shared struggle and survival, I felt something stir in me. Hope. Real, tangible hope for the future. But just as the moment settled, raised voices caught my attention across the courtyard. Mark was standing with his lawyer, his face red with anger. Even from a distance, I recognized the tense set of his shoulders, the way his fists clenched at his sides. For a brief second, the old fear rose in me, cold and familiar. I instinctively pulled Ethan closer, my heart quickening. But then I remembered Judge Davis's voice, calm but unwavering. "This court's rulings are not suggestions. I will enforce them to the fullest extent of the law." I exhaled slowly, letting the fear ebb away. Mark's rage wasn't mine to carry anymore. "Let's go home," I said softly, turning my back to the scene. Not to the apartment filled with painful memories, but to the shelter that had become our refuge, a place where new beginnings felt possible. Ethan tugged on my hand. "Mommy, can we stop by the park on the way back?" I smiled down at him. "Of course, sweetheart. We have time now." For the first time in years, I felt like we truly did. Missed the familiarity of the shelter, or asked questions about Mark that I didn't always know how to answer. But each day, we grew stronger, more settled in this new life we were building together. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across our small apartment, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, scribbling in a notebook. His brow furrowed in concentration, tongue sticking out slightly as he worked. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" I asked, setting down a plate of fruit beside him. He grinned up at me. "It's our new house, but I made it bigger. And there's a dog." I laughed softly, ruffling his hair. "Maybe one day." His face grew serious for a moment. "Mommy, do you think Papa will ever come here?" I knelt beside him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "No, sweetheart, the judge made sure of that. This is our place, just ours." Ethan nodded, as if satisfied with the answer. "I like it here. I like that we're happy now." I felt a lump rise in my throat, but it wasn't from fear. It was gratitude. "Me too, Ethan." A few months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Claire visited us. She brought over some paperwork and smiled warmly as she watched Ethan show her his school drawings. "You've built a wonderful life here, Maya," she said softly as we sat by the window sipping tea. "I can see it in Ethan. He feels safe." I gazed out at the park beyond the glass cat, watching the leaves drift lazily to the ground. "I never thought we'd get here," I admitted. "There were times I didn't think I could do this alone." Claire's eyes twinkled knowingly. "You weren't alone. And you're stronger than you think. You fought for this, for him. Don't forget that." Later that night, after Claire had left and Ethan was tucked into bed, I sat quietly in the living room, the hum of the city outside our window lulling me into thought. The fear that had once followed me like a shadow had faded, replaced by something else. Hope. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream about the future. About possibilities. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that no matter what lay ahead, Ethan and I would face it together. This was our new beginning. As the days slipped into months, Ethan slowly adjusted to our new life. But there were moments, quiet ones, when I saw the shadows of questions flicker in his eyes. He missed parts of his old life, even the ones I had tried so hard to shield him from. One afternoon, as we walked home from school, his small hand swinging lightly in mine, Ethan's steps slowed. "Mommy," he asked, his voice soft but serious, "does Papa not love us anymore? Is that why we don't see him?" His question struck deep, and I knelt beside him, heart aching as I met his gaze. "Oh, sweetheart," I said gently, brushing his hair back, "your father loves you very much. But he has things he needs to work on, things that made it unsafe for us to stay." Ethan's brow furrowed as he processed my words. "But we're safe now, right?" I pulled him close, wrapping him in the kind of hug I hoped could make him feel all the security I longed to give. "Yes, sweetheart. We're safe now." And we were. As the months passed, our little apartment slowly transformed. The walls, once bare, filled with Ethan's colorful artwork. Dinosaurs, rainbows, and scribbled drawings of us holding hands. Books from the library piled on the shelves, and little trinkets we found at flea markets dotted the space. It wasn't much, but it was ours. And it was enough. I made friends with other parents at Ethan's school. Slowly, the isolation I had once felt began to lift. Birthday party invitations started appearing in Ethan's backpack, and playdates became a regular part of our weekends. I even found strength in a support group for single mothers, sharing stories with women who understood the journey we were on. One evening, as I wiped down the bakery counter where I worked, my boss, Donna Elise, approached me. She was a warm woman in her 60s, her apron always dusted with flour, and her laugh lines deepened by years of kindness. "Maya," she said, her tone uncharacteristically serious, "I've been watching you these past few months. You work hard, and you've got a talent for this." I felt heat rise to my cheeks at her praise. "Thank you, Donna Elise. I enjoy being here." She nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "How would you feel about learning more? I could teach you some of my special recipes, and show you how to manage the books. Maybe even how to run the place." My heart raced. Was she offering me what I thought she was? "I'd love that," I stammered, barely believing the words coming out of my mouth. Her smile widened. "Good, we'll start tomorrow. Who knows, Maya? Someday, this place could be yours." That night, as I walked home under the glow of streetlights, the weight on my shoulders felt lighter. For so long, I had only thought about surviving, about getting through each day. Now, for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future. A future where we didn't just survive. We thrived. When I pushed open the apartment door, Ethan was sitting cross-legged on the couch, a book clutched in his lap. "Mommy," he grinned. "Can we read together?" I scooped him up, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's read." We curled up on the couch, his small body warm against mine. As I turned the pages and read aloud, the soft hum of our little home filled me with peace. Life wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, but we were together, safe, and rebuilding something beautiful. Later, as I tucked Ethan into bed, he looked up at me sleepily. His voice barely above a whisper. "Mommy, I'm happy." Tears pricked at my eyes, and I gently smoothed his hair back. "Me too, sweetheart," I whispered. "Me too." After closing his door softly, I lingered in the quiet of our home, taking in the space that we had filled with love. I thought about Judge Davis's words in the courtroom, the way she had stood firmly between us and Mark's attempts to control our lives. I thought of Claire and Rachel, of Lila, and all the women at the shelter who had carried me through the darkest moments. I thought of Donna Elise, who saw something in me that I had forgotten was there. And finally, I thought of Ethan, my brave, resilient boy who had been my strength even when I thought I had none left. We still had a long road ahead. Challenges would come, obstacles would rise. But as I looked around at the quiet glow of our apartment, I knew we could face whatever came our way. This was the beginning of our new chapter, and for the first time in a long time, I couldn't wait to see what the next page would bring.